ask yourself honestly, is the greatest pain in your life really failure, or the haunting truth that you never even dared to try? Think of those nights lying awake, chest heavy, not from defeats, but from doors you never opened, dreams you buried, words you left unsaid. The whisper of if only cuts deeper than any real setback. Which wounds more, failing once or living forever with what if? People say, don't be afraid, just go for it. But fear isn't that simple. It freezes you, whispering that if you fail, you are a failure. The Stoics knew this was distortion, not destiny. Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, they endured war, exile, and betrayal, yet saw fear as nothing more than imagination's trick. In this journey, you'll uncover 8 Stoic principles sharpened by modern psychology to break the cycle, face the shadow, and finally rewrite your life story. Part 1. Unmask the illusion. Fear often feels absolute. It sweeps over you in a moment, tightening your chest, speeding up your pulse, and whispering convincingly that disaster is waiting just ahead. But here is what the Stoics wanted you to notice. Fear is not a prophecy. It is an impression. And as Epictetus reminded his students 2,000 years ago, impressions are not facts. Just because your mind paints a vivid picture of failure does not mean that picture reflects reality. It may be no more than a shadow play inside your imagination. Modern psychology agrees. What you experience as fear is often anticipatory anxiety, your brain predicting that the worst will happen, then reacting as if it already has. Psychologists call this an error in emotional forecasting. You believe that if you fail, the pain will be unbearable, that you'll be exposed, rejected, or ruined. Yet when people actually face setbacks, the pain is usually lighter and more short-lived than imagined. In fact, studies show humans adapt to both positive and negative events far faster than they expect. That means the storm in your head is often far worse than the drizzle in real life. Think of a common situation. A colleague considers applying for a promotion. On paper, they're qualified, hardworking, and respected. Yet they hesitate, trapped in an inner movie where the boss smirks, the team laughs, and their hidden incompetence is revealed. They never file the application, not because reality denied them, but because their imagination bullied them into silence. Their fear wasn't about the promotion itself. It was about the catastrophic story they told themselves about what might happen. Psychologist Daniel Gilbert, in Stumbling on Happiness, shows how people routinely overestimate the intensity and duration of future emotions. In short, your imagination often invents suffering that never arrives. You imagine humiliation that doesn't come, rejection that fades quickly, or despair that never materializes. Fear thrives on these faulty forecasts, feeding on your guesses instead of your reality. The Stoics trained themselves to slow this reflex down. Instead of rushing to believe the first fearful impression, they paused and asked, "Is this real? Or is it only my judgment?" You can do the same. The next time fear grips you, don't let it sweep you away unchallenged. Stop for 30 seconds. Take a piece of paper, divide it into 2 columns. Label one column, facts. What has truly happened, what you know without exaggeration. Label the other column, fantasy. The imagined worst-case scenario that plays in your mind. Then compare the two. More often than not, you'll see that column A is thin and clear, while column B is bloated with speculation. This exercise breaks the reflex, reminding you that fear is not fate. For example, if you're afraid of sending out a job application, the fact might be, I haven't applied yet. The fantasy might be, if I apply, I'll be humiliated, rejected, and everyone will know I'm a fraud. Seeing it written down makes the distortion obvious. The fact is neutral. The fantasy is loaded with judgment. Which one deserves your energy? This practice doesn't eliminate fear entirely. The Stoics never promised that. What it does is loosen fear's grip, turning it from an invisible master into a visible thought. And once it's visible, you can examine it, question it, and choose whether or not to obey it. For the next 24 hours, make this your practice. Each time fear rises, pause, breathe, and write those 2 columns. Do it quickly, even messily. What matters is interrupting the automatic link between fear and paralysis. And when you've written it down, repeat a simple mantra. Fact, not fantasy. These 3 words anchor you back to reality, where life is lived. When you begin to see fear for what it is, an illusion more than a fact, you free yourself to ask a deeper question. Where did this fearful voice come from in the first place? If most fear starts as a borrowed projection, the next question is obvious. Where did that projection begin? Part 2. Break inherited fear. Escaping the fears you borrowed. There's a subtle truth you often overlook. Not every fear you carry is actually yours. Many of them are echoes, inherited whispers passed down from parents, teachers, or the culture that raised you. Marcus Aurelius once observed that the mind is shaped not only by its own choices, but also by the habits and voices it absorbs from others. What you call my fear might actually be someone else's anxiety that you never questioned. Think back for a moment. Did your parents warn you about failure as if it were a permanent stain? Did teachers ridicule mistakes instead of treating them as learning? Did society feed you stories of shame, rejection, and never good enough? Over time, those external voices slip beneath the surface. They begin to feel like your own. But the truth is, they are rehearsed scripts, old, borrowed lines that you keep performing without even realizing it. Modern psychology explains this phenomenon simply. Many of your recurring fears are echoes of early judgments. As a child, you had no power to filter them. When someone said, "Don't try that, you'll embarrass yourself," your nervous system learned to equate action with danger. Decades later, you still hesitate, but not because the present situation is genuinely threatening. You're reliving an emotional recording, replaying an outdated warning that no longer fits your life. Imagine a person who avoids love. They tell themselves, "I don't want to get hurt." But beneath that is something older, a childhood moment of rejection, or a memory of overhearing adults scoff at vulnerability. Each new relationship becomes a stage where the past repeats itself. The fear is not about the new person in front of them. It's about an old echo that still holds the microphone. Developmental psychologists call this conditioning. When a pattern of warning, ridicule, or judgment is repeated in childhood, it becomes ingrained as if it were a universal rule. But the truth is, these rules belong to the past, not to your present. They once served to protect a vulnerable child. Today, they mostly serve to restrict an adult. You play small, not because you've proven that risk is dangerous, but because someone else's old wound has been mistaken for your truth. The Stoics remind you to separate what belongs to you from what belongs to others. Marcus Aurelius urged himself daily to filter out unexamined impressions. When you pause and ask, "Is this truly my thought?" you begin to see the scaffolding behind the fear. It's not destiny, it's conditioning, and conditioning can be undone. So how do you begin breaking inherited fear in a practical way? Start small, within the next 24 hours. Choose one fear that seems to visit you again and again. Maybe it's the fear of speaking up in meetings. Maybe it's the fear of sharing your creative work. Write it down. Then ask yourself 2 simple questions. Who first told me this? And is it still true today? Write the answers honestly. You might discover that the original voice was a teacher who embarrassed you in 5th grade, or a parent who projected their own anxieties. You'll also likely realize that the authority of those voices no longer applies. What scared the child you once were doesn't have to control the adult you've become. This practice can feel disorienting at first because you're pulling away a mask that's been fused to your face for years. But as you do, you reclaim your own voice. You begin to recognize which fears are authentic, warning you of real danger, and which are inherited echoes, offering nothing but hesitation and delay. A mantra can help anchor this awareness. Not my voice. Each time you catch yourself stalling because of some vague, anxious echo, repeat it quietly. You'll feel the distance grow between you and the inherited script. You'll see that fear, not as your identity, but as a story someone else left behind. And here lies the turning point. Once you separate that borrowed voice from your own, the only way to prove your independence is practice. Start with small, safe failures. Part 3. Practice small failures, training through little defeats. You often imagine failure as something catastrophic, final, a collapse that proves your deepest doubts. But what if failure could be reframed, not as disaster, but as training? Seneca once reminded his students to rehearse hardship, to voluntarily practice discomfort, so that when real trials came, they would meet them with steady eyes instead of trembling hands. To the Stoic mind, small setbacks were not enemies, they were tutors. Modern psychology echoes this wisdom in a concept called hormesis. It's the idea that your system grows stronger, not by avoiding stress, but by being exposed to it in small, controlled doses. Just as lifting manageable weights prepares your muscles for heavier loads, facing small, safe failures strengthens your nervous system against bigger challenges. If you always shield yourself from risk, your tolerance for pressure shrinks. But if you let yourself stumble in low-stakes situations, you build the resilience to stand tall in high-stakes ones. Think about daily life. You might hesitate to share an imperfect idea at work, fearing judgment. Or you might avoid signing up for that dance class because you don't want to look clumsy. Yet these are precisely the arenas where practicing small failures can reshape you. Posting a piece of writing that isn't polished to perfection, trying a new hobby where mistakes are inevitable, or speaking up even when your voice shakes. These moments train your courage. Each little stumble becomes a repetition in the gym of resilience. Sarah Blakely, the billionaire founder of Spanx, grew up with a father who reframed failure entirely. At the dinner table, he didn't ask his children, "What did you succeed at today?" Instead, he asked, "What did you fail at?" If they had nothing to share, he was disappointed. For him, failure was not evidence of weakness, but proof of effort. That shift gave Sarah permission to experiment relentlessly. She learned to see each rejection not as humiliation, but as part of the process that would eventually lead to breakthrough. Without that training, she might never have had the courage to start her company with just $5,000 in savings and no experience in fashion. Her story reminds you that greatness is often the product of failing small, over and over, until the pattern carves out resilience. So how do you apply this? Within the next 24 hours, create a list of 3 small failures you could attempt this week. Maybe it's trying a recipe you've never cooked, even if it burns. Maybe it's sending an email to someone you admire, risking no reply. Maybe it's presenting a rough draft instead of waiting until it's flawless. Then choose one and do it today, for 30 to 60 minutes. Write down how you feel before and after. At first, the anticipation may feel sharp, the nervous energy of, what if I mess this up? But after, you'll often notice a surprising lightness. You survived. You may be surprised. The shame you feared often fades within hours. What remains is curiosity and a lesson. The Stoic training isn't about reckless leaps. It's about deliberate exposure in safe environments to the sting of imperfection. The goal is not to eliminate fear, but to prove to yourself that you can withstand it. By failing small, you learn fast. You recognize that mistakes are not verdicts, they are stepping stones. A mantra can help anchor this mindset. Fail small, learn fast. Whisper it before you send that imperfect project. Repeat it when you step onto the dance floor, or when you post that unpolished thought online. It reminds you that failure is not an end, but a practice, a way to sharpen your strength for greater challenges ahead. And once failure becomes familiar, even friendly, something deeper shifts. You stop measuring success only by flawless outcomes. You begin to see progress in the act of trying, in the courage of showing up. That is the bridge to the next step, redefining what success truly means so that your actions are liberated from fear altogether. Part 4. Redefine success. Freeing yourself from the tyranny of outcomes. One of the greatest prisons you build for yourself is the belief that success is defined solely by results. You set rigid benchmarks, a certain number of sales, a flawless performance, applause from others. And when those don't arrive, you brand yourself a failure. But the Stoics knew a deeper truth. Your worth is not measured by outcomes beyond your control. It's measured by your effort, your choices, and the quality of your attitude. Epictetus said it plainly. Focus on what is within your control and let go of what is not. You cannot decide how others will respond to your work, but you can decide how diligently you prepare. You cannot guarantee that the market will embrace your idea, but you can guarantee the discipline of showing up each day to build it. When you redefine success as effort rather than outcome, you free yourself from a standard that was never yours to carry. Contemporary research finds the same pattern the Stoics noticed centuries ago. Perfectionism, this obsession with flawless results, rarely fuels achievement. More often, it creates paralysis. When you measure yourself only by outcomes, you hesitate to act because anything short of perfection feels like humiliation. Yet when you measure progress by process, you create a system where every step counts. Each act of effort is already a form of success, and that momentum keeps you moving forward. Consider a practical example. Imagine you want to sell 100 copies of a product. If that's your only definition of success, every day you fall short feels like failure. But if instead you define success as writing 500 words a day to market your idea or making 3 calls to potential clients, suddenly success is within reach daily. The results may come later. In the meantime, you're already succeeding because you are honoring the process. You can see this principle in the lives of many creators and innovators. J.K. Rowling, before publishing Harry Potter, was rejected by multiple publishers. If her definition of success had been immediate acceptance, she would have stopped long before the world ever read her books. Instead, her measure was persistence, the act of continuing to submit, to refine, to keep trying. The outcome was outside her control, but her effort, that was always hers. So how do you put this into practice? For the next 24 hours, choose a goal you've been avoiding because the outcome feels intimidating. Then write down 3 process-based criteria you can control. If your dream is to write a novel, the process might be write 500 words today, no matter how rough. If your aim is to grow your business, the process might be send 1 email to a potential partner, research for 15 minutes, and sketch 1 new idea. The key is to define success by actions you can complete today, not by results that depend on someone else. When you finish, pause to recognize the achievement. That recognition retrains your mind to honor effort as the real victory. A mantra can help you root this shift in your daily mindset. Process over proof. Repeat it when you feel the urge to measure yourself against impossible standards. Let it remind you that proof, the external validation of success, will come in its own time, or perhaps not at all. What matters is the process you commit to, the courage to act without clinging to outcomes. And here's the subtle reward. When you redefine success this way, fear no longer paralyzes you. Instead, it becomes a compass. You start to notice where fear points the strongest, and you recognize that as the place where your growth is waiting. Fear is not a verdict. It is a map. And with each step measured by effort, not results, you walk that map with steady feet. Part 5. Use fear as compass, turning anxiety into direction. Most people treat fear as a stop sign. You feel the tightness in your chest, the quickening of your pulse, and your first instinct is to turn away. But the Stoics invite you to see fear differently. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that what stands in the way often becomes the way. The obstacle is not simply a barrier. It's a pointer. Fear does not always mean danger. More often, it means you've reached the boundary of your comfort zone. And just beyond that line is the place you most need to grow. Think about how this plays out in your own life. Suppose you dread speaking in front of a group. Your reflex might be to avoid presentations, to let others take the stage while you stay quiet. But what if the fear is not telling you to run away, but showing you where your next step of growth lies? The discomfort of public speaking might actually be pointing toward a hidden capacity for leadership. The trembling in your hands is not proof that you're incapable. It's proof that you're standing at the threshold of becoming more than you are today. Contemporary psychology points to the same truth. Fear is often a marker of developmental edges, the line where your current self meets the possibility of expansion. Therapists call the process exposure, and it describes how stepping toward what frightens you in small, measured ways builds tolerance, resilience, and mastery. Each time you lean into that fear instead of away from it, you train your nervous system to stretch its boundaries. Over time, what once felt terrifying becomes part of your ordinary strength. Take Brené Brown as an example. She became one of the most respected voices in modern psychology and leadership, not by avoiding fear, but by walking straight into it. She admits that her greatest dread was speaking openly about vulnerability, her own feelings of shame and inadequacy. Yet when she chose to confront that fear, to talk about what most people hide, it transformed her life. That act of stepping into fear awarded her credibility, influence, and trust with millions of people around the world. Her greatest fear became the source of her greatest impact. You can do the same on a smaller scale in your daily life. The next time you feel fear rising, pause and ask yourself a new question. If I moved through this fear, what is the best thing that could happen? Don't stop at the first anxious thought. Push further. Write down 1 or 2 positive outcomes that could come from stepping through the discomfort. If you're afraid to apply for a new role, imagine the possibility of learning skills you never thought you'd have. If you're scared to start a conversation, picture the connection and trust that might grow from it. By rehearsing the best-case scenario, you shift your brain from automatic avoidance to purposeful action, then take one small step in that direction. If public speaking terrifies you, don't wait until you're on stage before hundreds of people. Start by sharing an idea in a meeting with 3 colleagues. If rejection feels unbearable, practice by submitting 1 proposal or reaching out to 1 person, knowing that even a no is training for resilience. Each small step weakens the hold of fear and strengthens your trust in yourself. When you finally move, you may notice a tiny, unexpected lightness, a small, quiet tap on your shoulder that signals you can. Anchor this mindset with a mantra. Step toward the line. The line is where fear begins. Instead of retreating from it, let it mark the place where you step forward. Over time, this practice transforms your relationship with fear. It stops being a signal to turn back and starts becoming a compass, pointing to the places where growth, strength, and transformation await. Because here's the paradox. What you most fear is often the very thing that contains your freedom. Fear is not your enemy. It is your map. But to move through the line, you must stop choosing avoidance. Part 6. Stop choosing avoidance. Breaking the cycle of fear. You know that sinking feeling when you avoid something important. The phone call you don't return, the application you never submit, the project you keep saving for later. For a moment, avoidance feels like relief. Your heart slows down, the tension lifts, and you convince yourself you'll face it tomorrow. But tomorrow often becomes next week, and next week slips into years. Avoidance is not neutral. It is a choice. And every time you choose it, fear grows stronger. Seneca once warned that life is short for those who refuse to live it. When you spend your days dodging challenges, you don't protect yourself, you shrink yourself. You trade possibility for safety, but it's a safety that suffocates. Avoidance steals not just opportunities, but also dignity. It teaches your mind a damaging lesson. I can't handle this. And the more you repeat that message, the truer it feels. Modern psychology confirms this. Therapists have long recognized what they call the avoidance cycle. Here's how it works. You face a trigger that makes you anxious. You dodge it, and instantly you feel better. That relief acts like a reward, convincing your brain that avoidance is the right strategy. But the price is steep. Your fear doesn't fade. It multiplies. What once was a mild unease hardens into a crippling phobia, not because the challenge grew, but because you stopped growing. As Stephen Pressfield argues in The War of Art, the force called resistance will always urge you away from practice. The cure is to sit down and do the work, however briefly. Picture the painter who spends 20 years hiding canvases in the attic. Perhaps they fear judgment, or the label of not good enough. Yet, as years pass, what remains is not the safety of being uncriticized, but the sharp ache of regret. The avoided exhibition turns into a life unlived. Avoidance doesn't just postpone risk, it guarantees loss. On the other hand, consider the ordinary entrepreneur who dared to test an idea on a small scale. Maybe they were afraid of rejection, of losing money, of hearing that their product wasn't good enough. But instead of waiting for perfect confidence, they launched something modest, just a few sales, just a small experiment. They didn't avoid, they acted. And in acting, they discovered real feedback, real learning, and eventually real success. Their fear became data, their effort became growth. This is the crucial shift. Stop treating avoidance as the safer choice. Avoidance is the most dangerous choice because it creates permanent inaction. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision not to let fear choose for you. So how do you break the pattern? Start small. Right now, identify one thing you've been dodging. A call, a message, a submission, a first step. Don't promise yourself you'll complete it perfectly. Instead, commit to 5 minutes. Set a timer. Work on that avoided task for 5 minutes only. If you stop after that, it's still a victory. Why? Because you broke the cycle. You told your brain, I do not obey fear. That single act, however brief, rewires your habit from avoidance to engagement. Write it down. Mark in a journal. Today, I chose action for 5 minutes. Over time, those entries add up. 5 minutes becomes 10, then 30, then completion. But the power isn't in the length of time. It's in the choice to face instead of flee. Anchor yourself with a mantra. Do 5 minutes. Whisper it when your chest tightens, when you feel the pull to hide, when the temptation to wait feels strong. 5 minutes of courage outweighs 5 years of regret. The Stoics remind you that life is too short to spend in hesitation. Every avoided act is a page missing from your story. But every small choice to step forward, even briefly, is a sentence written, a chapter begun. Avoidance is easy. Action is meaningful. And once you've taken that step, something else awakens in you, the awareness of time's limits. You realize that postponing is not just delay, it is theft. It steals from your one finite life, which leads us to the next principle, remembering that you will die so that you may finally live. Part 7. Remember you will die, living with Memento. Mori. There is a truth you spend most of your life trying not to think about. One day, you will die. The Stoics never shied away from this reality. In fact, they embraced it. Memento Mori, remember you must die, was not meant as a morbid reminder, but as a compass. For Marcus Aurelius, it was the anchor that kept him focused on what mattered, stripping away the trivial and the petty. When you keep death in sight, fear loses its grip because you realize that much of what you're afraid of isn't worthy of your limited time. Psychology echoes this wisdom. Research shows that confronting mortality reduces anxiety about small things and clarifies meaning. When you remember that life is finite, the tiny embarrassments, rejections, and failures stop feeling catastrophic. They shrink into their true size, momentary discomforts in the context of a very short, very precious life. You begin to ask yourself better questions. Why am I spending hours worrying about what others think? Why am I postponing the work, the love, the adventure I say I want? Death does not diminish life, it sharpens it. You've likely seen this in your own life or in the lives of people around you. Maybe you know someone who kept saying they'd take that dream trip when the time was right. They put it off year after year until suddenly tragedy struck. The loss of a loved one, an unexpected diagnosis, a reminder that tomorrow is never guaranteed. Only then did they realize how urgent it was to live fully today. The regret wasn't just about the trip. It was about all the days spent waiting for a perfect time that never arrived. Consider Paul Kalanithi, the brilliant neurosurgeon who, at the height of his career, received a terminal cancer diagnosis. Confronted with the end of his life, he wrote, "When breath becomes air, a meditation on mortality and meaning." His confrontation with death reshaped every priority and became a call to live fully. Not someday, but now. His story forces you to see that awareness of mortality isn't a weight, but a liberation. When you know your time is limited, you can write your story instead of leaving it unfinished. This is what the Stoics understood. Memento Mori is not about gloom, but about clarity. It reminds you that your fears of embarrassment, of rejection, of imperfection are shadows compared to the true fear, reaching the end of your life and realizing you never dared to live it. Every day you avoid out of fear is a day you cannot get back. Every small act of courage is a way of honoring the life you've been given. So how can you practice this truth today? Take a simple exercise. Write down the sentence. If I had 1 year left to live, I would... Let yourself be honest. Maybe it's leaving the job you hate. Maybe it's repairing a broken relationship. Maybe it's finally starting the book, the business, the art you keep dreaming about. Choose one thing from that list and commit to beginning it this week. Don't wait for confidence. Put it in your calendar. Act as if your time is short, because it is. Support this practice with a mantra: one life, one choice. Repeat it when fear tempts you to delay. Every time you remember that your life has an end point, you gain courage to focus on what truly matters. You stop wasting energy on the small humiliations of failure and start investing it in the larger project of living fully. When you accept death, life becomes sharper, more vivid, and more urgent. The fear of failure loses its power because you see that the greater failure is never trying. And when you live with this awareness, you are ready for the final step, to consciously rewrite the story of who you are and who you will become. Part 8. Write a new story. Becoming the author of your life. For much of your life, you may have felt like a character in someone else's story. Circumstances, family expectations, society's demands, and even your own fears seem to dictate who you are and what you can do. The Stoics remind you of something radical. You cannot control everything, but you do control the narrative you tell yourself. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the mind is within your power, and with it, the story you create about your life. If you remain trapped in the story of fear, every challenge will feel like proof that you're destined to fail. But if you begin to write consciously, you step out of victimhood and into authorship. Modern psychology confirms this ancient wisdom through what is called narrative therapy. The idea is simple but profound. The stories you tell yourself shape your emotions, behaviors, and even your identity. If you describe yourself as someone who always fails, you will unconsciously live into that script. But if you reframe the narrative to, I am someone who experiments, learns, and grows, the same setbacks transform into stepping stones. By rewriting the frame, you change not just your interpretation of the past, but also the possibilities for your future. Think about the difference between two ways of seeing yourself. In the old story, you avoid risks because failure confirms your worst fears. In the new story, you embrace risks because each attempt is part of your journey. Instead of being crushed by rejection, you reinterpret it as evidence of courage. Instead of quitting when things get hard, you recognize that persistence is the defining trait of someone who is writing their own destiny. The shift is subtle in words, but massive in effect. From I failed to I tried. From I am weak to I am learning. This isn't abstract. Imagine someone who has always feared failure at work. Their old story might sound like, I'm not good enough, so I shouldn't even try. But one day, they consciously write a new one. I am a person who experiments. They start small, trying out a new skill, volunteering for a project they once avoided. Each small attempt builds momentum. The failures don't vanish, but they lose their sting. Because now, failure fits within the new script, an experiment, not a final verdict. Progress is no longer measured by perfection, but by participation. Your daily sentence is the scaffolding of the life you build. Small declarations turn into large accomplishments. You see this principle echoed in many real lives. Consider Maya Angelou, who faced extraordinary adversity and trauma early on. Her circumstances could have locked her into a story of silence and limitation, yet she chose to reframe her narrative. She became the author of her own life in the most literal sense, through poetry, memoirs, and activism. Her story was no longer about what had been done to her, but about what she could create from it. In her work, she proved that reframing your story doesn't erase the past, but transforms it into a source of strength. You can practice the shift today. Take out a piece of paper and write a short declaration. My old fear was Neid. My new story is Mayanide. Keep it brief, 2 to 4 sentences. Then place it somewhere you'll see every day. Your desk, your mirror, the background of your phone. For 7 days, read it out loud every morning. This isn't just repetition, it's reprogramming. Each time you affirm the new narrative, you weaken the old one and strengthen the belief that you are in charge of your life. Support this practice with a mantra. I author my life. Say it when you hesitate, when you doubt, when the old script tries to pull you back. These 4 words remind you that you are not a spectator waiting for permission. You are the writer holding the pen. When you change the story, something remarkable happens. Every so-called failure becomes just another chapter in your education. Every rejection becomes a redirection. Life is no longer a haunting record of what you never dared to attempt. Instead, it becomes a narrative of courage, growth, and authorship. And that is the true freedom the Stoics promised. Not control over the world, but mastery over the meaning you give it. Conclusion. Breaking free from the fear loop. Fear of failure can feel like an endless cycle. You hesitate, you avoid, you postpone, and the story you tell yourself grows heavier with each missed chance. But if you look back at the 8 steps we've explored, you'll see they form not scattered tips, but a clear path out of that loop. First, you learn to see fear for what it is, not a prophecy, but a signal. Then you separate from the sources that fed it, other people's judgments, outdated standards, the inner critic you mistook for truth. You practice in small steps, lowering the stakes until action feels safe again. You redefine success by measuring effort, not results, loosening perfectionism's grip. From there, fear itself becomes your compass. Instead of running, you recognize that what scares you often points to where you're meant to grow. You trade avoidance for repeated acts of courage. You remember your mortality, not to dwell on it, but to sharpen your focus on what matters most. And finally, you write a new story, no longer a passive character, but the author of your life. Together, these 8 principles create a cycle of growth that opposes the cycle of fear. Instead of paralysis, you gain momentum. Instead of shame, clarity. Instead of regret, meaning. Failure itself is neutral. The Stoics knew this long ago. What matters is the judgment you attach to it. Psychology agrees. Shift the frame, and the experience shifts with it. So the real question is not, what if I fail? But what story do I want to live? Each missed day is a page torn from the book of your life. You cannot staple those pages back. Every step forward, however small, writes a truer chapter before the curtain falls. Here's my invitation. Don't try to master all 8 steps. Choose one. Practice it every day for 7 days. Then notice how your relationship with fear begins to change. And when it does, share your story. Someone in the Unshakeable Calm community may need your courage to start their own.